The universe
Evacuate
had
the
always
sector.
been
Hostiles have
vast,
breached the platform.
cold,
It's an attack. Scatter.
indifferent to the fragile things that
Killing
crept
everyone.
through it.
Get out of here.
For billions
The ship
of
is
years,
here.
the stars burned in silence,
They're not hailing
watching
us.
civilizations rise and
Weapons
collapse
free.
like candles
Engage
in a
the
storm.
enemy. Open fire.
Nothing endured. That was the first rule.
Kill them all.
Civilizations grew
Attack.
complex, reached outward,
Fall back.
strained
Open
against the
fire.
limits of what their biology or technology
targets.
or ambition could sustain. And then they failed.
Run, they're attacking.
Some slowly, starved of resources or fractured by internal conflict. Some quickly, meeting something older and stronger out in the dark. Nothing endured. But nothing in those long, quiet ages had prepared the cosmos for the day the Krell turned their eyes toward the Orion Arm and found humanity waiting. The Krell were not a young species. They had walked among the stars when Earth was still molten rock, when the first single-celled organisms were merely a possibility drifting in primordial seas. They were ancient in the way only something truly alien could be ancient, not merely old, but fundamentally different from the inside out, shaped by millions of years of selection pressure that had carved away everything soft and slow and sentimental. They had no cities, no permanent homes. To the Krell, permanence was weakness, stillness was death. Every structure they built was temporary by design. Every position they held could be abandoned without warning. They believed, with a conviction carved into their very biology, that survival belonged only to the fast. Their warships reflected this philosophy perfectly. Long and impossibly slender, they looked less like vessels and more like the bones of some enormous predatory creature, needles of hardened glass and living light, threaded through with propulsion systems so advanced that human engineers would have wept at their elegance. These ships could cross star systems in hours. They moved in swarms, in silence, in the kind of graceful, coordinated violence that comes from 10,000 years of practice. The Krell did not besiege worlds. They swept through them. They had never needed to do otherwise. In the long history of their expansion across the galaxy's edge, no civilization had ever successfully held a fixed position against them for longer than a few days. Speed was everything. Speed was survival. Speed was truth. And so when they arrived at the small yellow sun on the outer edge of the galaxy's spiral, when their sensor arrays swept across the third rock in that unremarkable solar system and found a civilization clinging to its surface, they felt nothing more complex than mild curiosity. Humans. Small, slow, technologically significant but not alarming. A brief pause before the inevitable. They did not expect to find a city in their path. It appeared from the shadow of Earth's moon like a continent learning to fly, massive, slow, and utterly without apology. The Krell sensors processed the incoming data for several long seconds before transmitting an alert, because nothing in their classification system had a category for what they were seeing. Their instruments were calibrated for ships, for objects designed around the principles of speed, of minimal mass, of streamlined purpose. What drifted toward them now obeyed none of those principles. It was called the Bastion. 5 miles deep, 10 miles wide, a slab of iron, lead, and reinforced steel so enormous that it generated its own detectable gravitational signature. Not enough to pull in asteroids, but enough that the Krell fleet's navigation systems registered it as a local anomaly and adjusted course slightly before the pilots overrode the correction. It did not have engines built for racing. It had engines built for moving a continent through space. Slow, grinding, relentless drives that burned at a constant low roar, pushing millions of tons of compressed metal through the void with all the elegance of a glacier and all the inevitability of one too. Where Krell ships were arrows, the Bastion was a wall. Where Krell ships were designed to avoid damage by never being where the damage was, the Bastion was designed to take any damage the universe could produce and simply continue existing. Krell Captain Var of the Vanguard fleet stared at the readouts for a long moment. Then he ordered the first strike. Because what else do you do when a wall is in your way? 1,000 beams of focused plasma erupted from the Krell Formation. Each beam was calibrated to temperatures hot enough to vaporize titanium on contact. Together, they hit the forward hull of the bastion in a curtain of white gold light that would have been beautiful from a distance and lethal from anywhere closer. On any other vessel in the known galaxy, the crew would have died before they felt the heat. The bastion's outer armor plating absorbed the strike. On the secondary thermal sensors, the temperature reading ticked up by 11 degrees. Inside the city, a technician named Leo Vance looked up from his console in the cooling sector and frowned at a mild warning light. He checked the readout. Secondary armor thermal variance. Within normal parameters for a micrometeorite swarm, slightly elevated. He reset the display, decided it was a sensor calibration issue, and went back to his coffee. Part 2. The city inside the fortress. To understand why the bastion existed, you have to understand what it contained. It was not, at its heart, a weapon. It was a city. A real city, with all the complicated, stubborn, breathing life that implied. 47,000 residential units, 11 elementary schools and 4 secondary academies, a university with 7 faculties, and a library that held the largest collection of physical books outside Earth's surface archives. 3 hospitals, a theater district with venues ranging from an intimate black box stage to a concert hall that seated 4,000 and had hosted the premieres of 17 original operas. Restaurants, coffee shops, a neighborhood in Ring 6 known for its street market, held every third day of the week cycle, where vendors sold everything from handmade ceramic work to hydroponic vegetables to extremely questionable antiques, whose provenance was always a matter of lively dispute. Parks, real parks, with real soil imported at extraordinary cost from Earth, where oak trees grew in slightly lower gravity and their roots had learned to spread wide and shallow, anchoring themselves against the subtle shifts of artificial rotation. Children played under these trees. Old people read under them. Couples argued and reconciled and argued again. The parks were small by planetary standards, but on the bastion they were precious. Pocket-sized pieces of a world most of the population had never visited, maintained by a team of dedicated horticulturalists who treated their charges with an almost religious devotion. The city was arranged in concentric rings, each one serving a different purpose. The outermost rings were the fortress's muscle, foundry floors running at full capacity, ammunition factories cycling through 20-hour production days, barracks housing rotating shifts of soldiers and engineers, hangars where the bastion's complement of smaller craft were maintained, armed, and launched. Moving inward, the rings softened. Commercial districts gave way to community centers. The middle rings held the residential blocks, the schools, the parks. The evidence that what lived inside these hull plates was not an army with civilians attached, but a civilization that had learned to defend itself. And at the very center, deep within layers of reinforced hull and shielded corridors and systems upon systems of protective engineering, sat the core. But more on that later. Leo Vance had been born in Ring 7. He had never set foot on Earth. His parents had been born on the Bastion, and his grandparents had been among the original engineering crew who had helped install the tertiary coolant systems in what was now the neighborhood where Leo bought his groceries. 3 generations of Vances, all born and raised in the belly of a fortress that most of humanity's history would have found incomprehensible, and all of them perfectly at home. He knew the Bastion the way people who grow up in small towns know their home, not as a place of wonder, but as the texture of ordinary life, the smell of recycled air, slightly metallic at certain times of day when the atmospheric processors cycled through their maintenance sequence, the sound of the hull flexing under thermal load in the deep hours of the night, a low groan that old-timers called the bastion settling, like a house adjusting to the cold. The way the artificial light in the parks shifted through a 26-hour cycle designed to approximate a planetary day, moving from warm gold to cooler afternoon light to the gentle amber of evening. Though Leo had never entirely been sure what a real planetary day was supposed to feel like. His job was to manage the thermal load from the fusion core, to make sure the enormous heat generated by the city's power source didn't creep through the bulkheads into the residential sectors and turn the apartments of Ring 7 into a slow oven. It was unglamorous work. It required deep knowledge of fluid dynamics, heat transfer, materials science, and the specific quirks of a cooling system that had been retrofitted, patched, upgraded, and adjusted so many times over 3 generations that the only people who truly understood all of it were the team of 6 technicians who spent their working lives inside it. The Bastion's engineers had long ago calculated that this team, collectively, kept approximately 400,000 people from being slowly cooked alive. Leo took a certain quiet satisfaction in that. The social structure of the Bastion was unlike anything else in human history. Every citizen carried a role in the city's defense, alongside their civilian occupation, not as a burden imposed from above, but as a fact of culture absorbed from birth. The baker on the corner of Ring 5's commercial district had been trained in emergency triage and could establish a field medical station from available materials in under 4 minutes. The elementary school teachers were certified in structural damage assessment. The theater director had a secondary qualification in hull breach response protocols and had on 2 previous occasions of minor incident led a crew of stagehands in successfully sealing a coolant leak that would have compromised 3 residential blocks. This was not coercion. It was something more durable than coercion. It was culture. A culture built over 3 generations of living inside a fortress, of understanding at a bone-deep level that survival was a collective project, that the person next to you was simultaneously your neighbor and, when necessary, your crewmate. Children grew up understanding this. It was not a lesson taught in school so much as something absorbed from the texture of life, from seeing the adults around you treat every skill as potentially life-saving, every person as potentially essential. The Krell, observing what limited intelligence they could gather about life aboard the Bastion, interpreted this as slavery. They saw a population shackled to a machine, forced to maintain and serve and die for it, unable to leave or imagine leaving. They could not conceive of the alternative explanation, that the humans loved their fortress, that they had chosen it and kept choosing it, generation after generation, because it was their home, that the thought of leaving was not liberation, but loss. The Bastion was not a cage. It was the shape freedom had taken. Part 3. Iron Rain. Admiral Sarah Reed had seen the Krell fleet before they fired their first shot. She had been watching them for 6 days, since the moment their formation had been detected by the long-range sensor arrays embedded in the Bastion's outer hull. 6 days during which the fortress had completed a quiet, thorough reorganization of its defensive posture. 3 times as Reed and her staff worked through scenarios and refined their approach. 6 days of supply inventories and equipment checks, and factory floors shifting from mixed production to ammunition priority. 6 days of Reed spending her evenings in the tactical suite with her senior staff, building plans and stress testing them, and throwing out the ones that didn't survive scrutiny until what remained was something she could commit to. When the plasma barrage hit, when the Krell fired their opening salvo and the hull shuddered with a sound like a distant thunderclap heard through stone, Reed was already seated at her command station with a half-finished cup of coffee at her elbow, watching the energy readouts with the calm expression of someone who has prepared carefully and is now simply watching to see if reality matches the plan. "They're too fast for our conventional tracking," her tactical officer, Commander Yuri Nkemderim, announced. His voice was controlled, professional, with only the smallest edge beneath it. The Krell ships moved in patterns that defied predictive targeting, never holding a position, never flying straight, executing evasive maneuvers at speeds that made locking solutions obsolete by the time they were computed. Every targeting solution her team generated was stale before it was ready. Then we stopped trying to track them individually, Reed said. She set down her coffee. First defensive layer, full activation. All automated cannons, wide pattern dispersal fire, fill the space around us. And Chemdirham paused. That's not precision fire, Admiral. No, Reed agreed. It's not. What it is math. They have to occupy the same space we're defending. We're going to make that space very unpleasant. 2,000 automated turrets across the bastion's surface began firing simultaneously, not at specific targets but into the surrounding void, overlapping fields of steel shot that turned several cubic miles of space into a kill zone. The Krell doctrine had never accounted for an enemy who would simply make movement itself lethal. Moving at their speeds through a cloud of shrapnel produced results that no targeting system needed to calculate. The Krell lost ships not to accuracy, but to physics. The first phase of the battle lasted 4 days. The Krell adapted. They always adapted. It was part of what had made them so formidable for so long. They pulled back, recalibrated, changed approach vectors to minimize exposure time. Then they brought in the heavy units, planetary bombardment vessels, mountain-sized ships designed not for fleet combat, but for the systematic destruction of inhabited worlds. Siege engines with engines. They surrounded the bastion at a gravitational choke point the cartographers called Orion's Gate. The siege that followed lasted 3 weeks without a single moment of silence. The bastion shuddered constantly under Krell suncracker beams, weapons engineered to fracture tectonic plates, now directed at a target that simply refused to fracture. The shields ran white-hot. Outer armor layers were eaten away in meters, then dozens of meters, repair crews working in suits and harnesses on the hull's exterior, welding new plates over old wounds while the bombardment continued around them. A job that required a specific combination of technical skill and cold-blooded disregard for their own circumstances that the crews had somehow made routine. Inside Ring 7, Leo Vance managed his cooling shifts. He came home. He watched the news. He went to sleep to the sound of the hull groaning with a frequency slightly different from its normal settling groan, one he had cataloged in his private notes as siege resonance. He woke up. He went to work. Once, a particularly intense suncracker strike rattled the towers hard enough to throw a water glass from his counter. He swept up the pieces, made tea instead, and went to work. The fortress held because the people inside it had already decided that holding was the only option. Then Reed activated the Iron Rain protocol. Every outer cannon went silent simultaneously. The sudden absence of that constant thunder was for those first minutes genuinely disorienting. A silence so abrupt it almost had physical weight. The Krell read the change as ammunition exhaustion or systems failure, a sign of weakness. They began closing the distance. What they didn't know was that the bastion had begun venting its atmosphere. In precisely calculated bursts, the fortress released compressed oxygen and water vapor into the surrounding void. In the cold of space, these clouds froze instantly into crystalline mists, dispersed, barely visible, and enormously disruptive to the focused energy weapons the Krell were using. The suncracker beams hit the frozen particulate and scattered. Not entirely, but enough. The targeting precision that had been chewing through the bastion's outer layers dropped sharply. Through the mist, the Wasp ships emerged. They were not beautiful. Nobody had designed them to be. They were engines with a cockpit bolted to one end and 2 extremely heavy guns bolted to the other. No luxury, minimal shielding, fuel calculated for one direction. The pilots had all volunteered. They understood the arithmetic. They didn't need to survive the return trip. They only needed to get close enough to the Krell hulls to deliver their payload at a range where accuracy was irrelevant. The Krell lost 14 capital ships in 2 hours. But it was the Star Eater that changed everything. The Krell flagship, a vessel classified as a system killer, designed for the annihilation of inhabited worlds, brought its primary weapon to bear. The dark energy beam it fired punched through 3 layers of Bastion armor before emergency bulkheads could fully deploy. A section of Ring 12 was open to the vacuum. 500 meters of city ceased to exist. For the first time, alarms rang in the residential sectors. And then, the Bastion began moving forward. Not retreating, advancing, toward the Star Eater, toward the center of the Krell fleet, with all its continent-moving engines running at full output. Captain Var watched the readings. In his long military career, spanning decades of conquest across a dozen inhabited systems, he had never encountered an enemy that responded to a crippling strike by closing the distance. He had no tactical doctrine for this. He had no cultural framework for it. What he felt, though he would not have used the word, was dread. Part 4. The Core. The secret of the Bastion was not its armor. It was not its guns. It was not even the iron stubbornness of 10 million people who refused to consider any outcome except survival. The secret was the core. 3 generations ago, a deep space survey team had found ruins on a planet with no name in any catalog. A world of glass and stillness, dead for longer than humanity had possessed agriculture. Among the ruins was a device, compact by the standards of what it could do, incomprehensibly dense, radiating an energy signature that the survey team's instruments could detect but not categorize. It took 40 years of study to begin to understand what it was, another 20 to build technology capable of using it safely, another decade to install it at the heart of the Bastion, surrounded by the most sophisticated engineering humanity had ever produced, tended by a team of specialists who had spent their careers studying a single machine. It was a gravity anchor. More precisely, it was a device capable of generating and precisely directing gravitational force at scales that redefined what was physically possible for any vessel. It did not merely power the Bastion systems, though it did that, feeding the city's energy needs as a secondary effect of its operation. It allowed the Bastion to reach into space-time itself and reshape a region extending several miles from the hull. Used in small doses, carefully, it had produced effects that seemed almost unremarkable. Slightly improved structural cohesion, better inertial response, a modest enhancement to acceleration. The core engineers had used these capabilities quietly, routinely, for years. Full power had never been used. As the Bastion closed on the Star Eater, the core room went to emergency protocols. 12 engineers worked in reinforced suits capable of theoretically protecting them from the gravitational stress of a collapsing stellar body. Theoretical being the operative word, since no one had tested this, and began the power sequence that their predecessors had designed and that none of them had expected to actually run in their working lifetimes. The mathematics were unambiguous. At maximum output, the core would either destroy the Krell fleet or destroy the Bastion. The gravitational shear forces at full power exceeded the hull's structural tolerances by a precisely calculated margin. If the hull held, the Krell fleet would be annihilated. If it didn't, the city would collapse into a singularity. The protocol documentation acknowledged this possibility in careful technical language, without any evident emotion on the part of whoever had written it. Reed authorized the protocol from the command center. She did not look away from the screens. The core began to hum. Not through air, through matter, through metal and bone, in the fundamental fabric of physical law. A vibration operating at frequencies the human nervous system registered as a kind of presence, a weight, a sense that the rules were changing. In the parks of Ring 4, the oak trees trembled as though in a wind that wasn't there. In the schools, children looked up from their lessons. In the cooling sector, Leo Vance watched his instruments behave in ways his training had not covered, checked calibration twice, and then looked at the power draw reading and understood exactly what was happening. Space bent. The Krell ships found their controls unresponsive. Not damaged, overridden by something operating at a more fundamental level than their propulsion systems. Something that didn't care about their technology or their speed or the tens of thousands of years of accumulated tactical expertise that had made them the apex predators of a dozen star systems. They were being pulled, like iron filings to a magnet, without drama, without the possibility of resistance. The physics didn't offer an exception clause. The smaller vessels went first. They tumbled into each other, hulls breaching under gravitational differentials their materials were never designed to withstand. Larger ships held longer, pouring everything they had into fighting the pull and losing. The Star Eater's hull began to deform in slow motion, along stress lines that its designers had never anticipated needing to account for. In the core room, the lead engineer watched the Bastion's structural integrity readings with the focus of someone doing the most consequential calculation of their life. The numbers were not good. Inner hull rings flexing beyond design parameters. Load-bearing sections approaching failure thresholds. The core was running the Bastion to the absolute edge of what it could physically survive, and the question of whether the edge held was not one the mathematics could answer in advance. She kept the output where it was. The Star Eater broke apart in stages. On the screens in the command center, Admiral Reed watched the Krell fleet become a debris field, a graveyard of twisted metal scattered across what had been Orion's gate. She felt no triumph. The dead were the dead. What she felt was the specific, grim exhaustion of someone who has done something terrible and necessary and will carry it forward. Core output declining, the display reported, hull integrity stabilizing. In the parks, the oak trees stopped trembling. What comes after the silence? The final day of the war arrived not with thunder, but with a sudden, haunting quiet. The surviving Krell vessels, a handful of fast scouts, a damaged support ship that had been at the outer edge of the gravity field's range, fled into the void. No surrender transmission. The Krell had no cultural framework for surrender. They had never needed one. They simply ceased and departed, leaving behind their dead and the silence. The Bastion floated alone in the debris field, hull scarred, lights flickering in sections where power conduits had taken damage. 12 separate breach points leaking atmosphere in small silver plumes that the repair crews were already racing toward. Broken in places, hurting, still there. Humanity had survived. The cleanup took years, and the years were not quiet ones. The wreckage of the Krell fleet was processed systematically, metal reclaimed, refined, fed into the outer ring foundries to repair the damage the siege had done. The Bastion grew stronger in the places it had been broken, the way bone grows denser along fracture lines. New hull sections rose where old ones had been destroyed. The theater in Ring 3, closed for the duration, reopened with a production that played to sold-out houses for 47 consecutive performances. Leo Vance returned to his cooling shifts. He submitted a transfer application to the core engineering team, noting his experience maintaining operational continuity through a major breach event and his familiarity with anomalous thermal conditions. The application was approved. He spent the rest of his career working with the most complicated and most important piece of technology in human history, the gravity anchor from a dead civilization, now tended by living hands, and he still went home to Ring 7 at the end of each shift. Still stood on his balcony and watched the transport ships moving between the towers in the artificial evening light. Still felt, without needing to examine the feeling too closely, at home. Other species came, not to conquer. The story of Orion's Gate had moved fast through the communication networks connecting the inhabited galaxy. And it had done something unusual. It had made people stop and reconsider their assumptions. A species that should have been prey had turned out to be something the established categories didn't account for. Ambassadors arrived from 14 civilizations within the first decade. Some came to negotiate trade or security agreements. Some came to study the Bastion's engineering or to attempt to understand the gravity anchor. Several came for no reason they would officially admit to. They came because the story was the kind of story that demands to be seen, to be stood inside, to be made real by proximity. Admiral Reed, retired now and living in a small apartment in Ring 9 with a view of the artificial sky, met them all. She was patient. She understood that what had happened at Orion's Gate would take generations to fully absorb, not just for humanity, but for the wider galaxy, which had operated on certain assumptions about the relationship between speed and power, between mobility and survival, for a very long time. They all asked the same question eventually: how? And Reed told them the same thing every time. "We didn't build a city for war," she said. "We built a city for peace, for schools and hospitals and parks and theaters, for all the ordinary things a life requires. And then we found ourselves having to protect it because the alternative was losing it, and that was something we were not willing to do." The Krell thought the Bastion was a weapon aimed outward. They were wrong. It was a home aimed inward, a place worth protecting, and people willing to protect it. There is nothing in the universe more difficult to take from someone than that. The Bastion became, in the years that followed, something nobody had planned for: a neutral ground, a place where the representatives of civilizations that had spent centuries regarding each other with suspicion could meet under the protection of human iron, on the understanding that the humans hosting them had demonstrated a rather emphatic commitment to defending their territory. Disputes were negotiated in conference rooms in Ring 3, a short walk from the theater district. Trade agreements were signed in a building that had been a school 3 years earlier, with children's artwork still on some of the walls because nobody had gotten around to taking it down, and eventually it had been decided it should stay. The floating fortress was no longer a secret weapon. It had become something stranger and more enduring, a monument to the idea that size is not the same as strength, that speed is not the same as power, and that the most formidable force in the universe is not a weapon, but a life that has decided it will not end. Leo Vance's granddaughter was born in Ring 7, in the same hospital where Leo had been born, and her daughter after her. Each generation learned the Bastion the way their parents had, as the texture of ordinary life, as home, as the particular smell of recycled air, and the sound of the hull settling in the night, and the way the parks looked in the artificial evening.